Book we read was about the myths of the Spanish conquest. I definitely wanted to read about the encounter of the Europeans and the Americans and the world and the myths and the structure of that by the historian Matthew Restall. Then we read a book, for some of you has now moved on to a parent, by Chris Lane about Potosi. And I definitely wanted to read about the silver city that changed the world. I thought that was super important to understand that history. And then we read Three Ancient Colonies by Sidney W. Mintz. I definitely wanted to read something about the Caribbean and sugar and enslavement in that area. It seemed like an important thing to do. However, then I ended up with this lineup of authors. Huh? He does. Yeah. And I mean, it's not that all of them pay attention to issues that I want to have paid attention to and cover topics that I want to have covered and those kinds of things. But you might notice there's something about them that's all the same. Yeah. And, that's not inherently bad. I mean, I don't want to get too down on people like myself, but, So I figured we needed something else for topical reasons because a super interesting topic. An anthropologist, I think probably our most difficult to understand book, unfortunately, but very interesting stuff. Yeah, so our representative of both of someone from the region and someone who is different than our other authors. Bonilla is drawing on her own mentor, Michel-Rolph Trouillot. Bonilla studied with Trouillot at Chicago, University of Chicago. I studied with Trouillot at Hopkins in Baltimore in graduate school before, and just an enormously brilliant person. You've heard a few things from him already, but we'll hear some other things from him within this book and inspired by him. Haitian scholar, and Bonilla was probably one of his last students before he had to stop teaching and then passed away about a decade ago. The last book that he wrote that was called Global Transformations, Anthropology and the Modern World. And Bonilla draws upon Trouillot, among others, to discuss this issue of sovereignty. What it means to be sovereign. I guess this is a big word, huh? Sovereignty, sovereign. What does it mean? There's a deeper history there where you're talking about the sovereign, right? So the sovereign is the one who has the power. In today's world, it's kind of come to mean having political autonomy as a country, having sovereignty, having control over a country. But it's good that you bring that up, because what Bonilla is doing, drawing on Trouillot, is to say that sovereignty belongs to what Trouillot called a family of North Atlantic universals. And what he meant by that are these words that seem to be just descriptive. Do you have sovereignty or not? bring in the next quote. But they're not just about describing how the world is. Hidden within them is a prescription that we should all want to be sovereign, that we need to be in a sovereign country. And if you are not a part of a sovereign country, that you're somehow deficient or behind or left outside of the modern world. And so Trouillot uses the words that these terms are seductive. And what he means by that, I think, is that one, they hide their particular origin. So someone or something that is seductive has to somehow be hiding something, you might say. That's what makes it alluring. And so he said that they hide their origins in Europe, and they have this sort of, you desire them, but once you get them, they often are disappointing. Kind of like that sexy classroom over there when it was all dark and the lights are low and it looks all cool in there, but then you go in and you're like, it's just a class. So what Bonilla is talking about here is in the Caribbean, after colonization, or after after colonization was wrapping up, you might say, there was the post-colonial or after-colonial dream of having your own nation, of national independence. And that would be, something that you'd strive for in the formerly colonized countries. But she says, and this is, again, like I said, this is probably a more difficult book to read because she's using some big terms and drawing on a lot of a whole history of ideas, is that the people that she's talking about and studying, and the reason she titles her book Non-Sovereign Futures, is that she wants to get out of these ideas that there's other forms of life, because in fact, for many people, the nation state, just having your own independent nation state, has been quite disappointing and hasn't lived up to its promises. So she says that what she's trying to do, or the people that she's working with, are trying to get out of this bind of sovereignty, while still being compelled to think through its normative categories, which is to say that you're trying to find something else, trying to figure out a new way forward, but you're still trapped in those ideas from before. And so she says back on page 5 that the people she's working with, one of them says he doesn't have the transcripts of the future. They are in the process of prefiguring worlds that they cannot describe. And so the idea is that through their activities, through their, in this case, labor activism, well, I guess that maybe it needs to be read, the tactics of labor activists, not as simple means to clearly articulated ends, but as generative forms of prefigurative politics through which participants can imagine, conjure, and inhabit alternative social and political forms. What he's saying is, in this process of trying to do a union strike or activity, they're trying to imagine alternative political forms and sort of create them on the spot, even if they can't completely articulate them, or even if they're coming out in those old-fashioned categories that they're trying to get away from. And so there's a number of reasons why I think this book is important. Again, the topic, the place, is super interesting. The ideas are interesting, but I'm also here thinking about, in some ways, our last 3 books, I would say, have been, when you get to the end of them, and I know we haven't been able to write on the end chapter, as has been stated, when you get to the end of them, they get, to me at least, somewhat depressing. Maybe that's why I don't want you to have to write on the end of them, because you get to the end and it's like, Oh, well, let's see. End of rest all. Well, we're still in the age of expansion. I hope this works out. Or how about Potosi, you get to the end and it's like, well, before that whole thing crumbles, I hope we think about whether we've made a deal with the devil or not. And Mintz, you get to the end and it's like, well, that was a great thing the enslaved people do to create this wonderful new world, but they're all gone now. Peasantry's gone now. Anyway, they all end up pretty historical and sort of back in the past. And I wanted to give us something about what people are actually trying to do now in places to sort of rethink or reimagine what the future could be like, not just dwelling upon the past. Now, big word, sovereignty. Why would Yarimar Bonilla care about sovereignty? From Puerto Rico, she was, sometimes I have students read the preface where she talks about, it wasn't, she heard this from an early age when she'd be in, marches or rallies and someone would say, Viva long will Puerto Rico, free and sovereign. So this was a political chant, so it's not just something in the abstract. But, the history there or the present status of Puerto Rico is kind of in the same boat here in the sense that, they keep having votes about whether to be sovereign, whether to be independent or to be a state, and they keep ending up kind of in the same position. And, the question is, well, how do you maintain that position? So yes, she is Puerto Rican origins. She doesn't tweet much these days, but the last thing she retweeted was this thing kind of made me want to take this class with the Bad Bunny syllabus that would tell us about Puerto Rico and resistance in Puerto Rico and through the music and lyrics of Bad Bunny. Nah, I'm not that cool of a professor. I can't do it. Stuck with my own self. That would be more fun, more sexy. All right, so France. France is so big still. Look at all those places that technically belong to France. Crazy. Look at that. In this case, we're going to be talking about specifically Guadeloupe, but also because it's so close and so related and so interconnected, the island of Martinique. Not so much about French Guiana, but that's part of the system. These are 3 official departments of France. They're like, they're similar to how I guess Hawaii or Alaska would be to the United States. But they use the euro. Their official language is French. They're citizens of France. They vote in French elections. They have representation in parliament. Obviously not completely equal, but, an interesting situation to be in. And French Guiana is the only place on the mainland of South America that is like this, that is not its own independent country. But in the Caribbean, as we'll see, there's a lot of places like this. As you can see from this map, sometimes France is, when Bonilla describes it, she describes it as the metropole, metropolitan France. So sometimes if you're confused when she talks about people going to the metropole, that's France. France, like the place in Europe. She also calls it the hexagon. I know, it's strange, but apparently I looked this up. The French do this too. They think their country is shaped like a hexagon. There it is. So sometimes they'll say for example, with they say a mayor, he was the first political state funeral outside of the hexagon, which is France. I know. They never taught you that in French? Yeah, it's funny little facts about the French. They think of their country as a hexagon, kind of like we think of, huh? Ask about it. See if that's true. You can look it up. You can Google it. You can see somebody draws a little hexagon around it. It goes back a long time. True? I know, weird, huh? Never thought of it. I mean, Italy, it looks like a boot, but a hexagon? Kind of boring. Anyway. That's a whole different class, French history, it's called. We're still in the Caribbean. So, on the face of it, right, these places that use the euro, have French as an official language, vote in French elections. Actually, one of the reasons I got into this was during the raging COVID years, I'd look all around the world at like different statistics about where COVID was. And there was a long time that French Guiana was like really high on the COVID scale. But the thing is, all their statistics went into the nation of France instead. And it led me to wonder what the heck was going on there. And that's what's going on. So you have these places. So there are, of course, sovereign countries in the Caribbean. There's, of course, Cuba and Jamaica, we've heard about, and Haiti, we talked about the Haitian Revolution, the Dominican Republic, also independent. Puerto Rico, not. Trinidad and Tobago, yes, those two islands together. And many of these places, these little islands here, are also independent, but as Bonilla describes, it's actually not, it's not an anomaly to be not quite or not really sovereign in the Caribbean. So there's that wonderful table 1 on pages 7, 8, and 9, which talks about different political forms within the Caribbean. And if you count them up, there's more non-sovereign places than there are sovereign places. And then she says on page 10, places like Guadeloupe, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Anguilla, Aruba, Bermuda, Bonaire, Cayman Islands, Curacao, Saba, St. Bartolome, St. Martin, and the Turks and Caicos all fall outside of the legal definition of either independent states or formal colonies. So they're somewhere kind of in between. They're not independent, but they're not colonies either. Then, in addition, the Caribbean also holds a large number of non-sovereign enclaves, military bases. Oh, what's the most famous military base in the Caribbean? It's in Cuba. Think of, there it is, right there. Here we have Fidel Castro being all communist and being all riled up, getting us all excited. And it turns out we own this military base right there in Cuba. Right there, they can't have it. We got it. Nobody even knew about this, by the way, for a very, very long time. We have like 100-year, maybe 100-year or maybe an infinite lease on this land. And so the Cubans, even though they're all crazy communists down there and about to kill us all, they won't touch us as long as we're in Guantanamo Bay in that military base. I learned this when I was your age in college. I went back and I told my dad, who was very anti-Castro, and he said, nah, that can't be right. That can't be right. He grew up during like the John F. Kennedy 60s era when like, you know, the whole nuclear crisis and all that stuff. Didn't believe me. Now everybody knows because we ship a bunch of prisoners there and do things to them. But at the time, he didn't believe me. Okay, military bases, privately owned islands. Those are always nice. Semi-autonomous tourist resorts. also beautiful to travel to. Free trade zones, tax havens, wildlife preserves, satellite launching stations, detention centers, penal colonies, floating data centers. I know, David, maybe that's where your data's all going. Floating data centers. That's what you do, right? Sort of. Around there. Kind of something, maybe some days. Yeah. And other spaces of suspended, subcontracted, usurped, or imposed foreign jurisdiction that challenge the principles of bounded territorial authority. So, what she's trying to say is this is a whole region where the whole idea of being a country, an independent sovereign country, is actually in some ways more the exception than the rule. And even for the places that are technically their own country, technically sovereign, it's a hard place to be a country in. It's a difficult thing to do. And for this, hey, there's my floating data center when I need it. She's in part asking us, or in some ways talking again about the Haitian Revolution, which we talked about one or two classes ago and watched this wonderful film about the Haitian Revolution because we hadn't heard about it and how amazing it was that enslaved people were able to create their own nation. And that is amazing, and it's justly needs to be heard of. But Bonilla is also saying that at least for Louverture, for Toussaint Louverture, who we saw in the film, and we saw what he wanted, his idea was not actually to be an independent country. He saw himself as serving the French nation, and his idea was that Haiti, or what is now Haiti, would be free and French. On page 12, even by 1801, the project and vision was not that of a sovereign state, but of an autonomous polity, free and French within the larger imperial formation of France. France, however, refused to reckon with this novel arrangement, and Napoleon sent a military expedition to arrest Toussaint, the Revolutionary War, end the Revolutionary War, and restore slavery in the colonies, precipitating the final break. So then she says that, the problem has been that, yes, Haiti gained its freedom, its independence, but it is not a coincidence. It is surely not coincidental that the first Black Republic of the Caribbean is today emblematic of the failures rather than the possibilities of modern sovereignty in the region. So it was a difficult independence, in part because, as we talked about, it was not recognized by other countries, and France put it into debt to itself in order to buy itself, technically buy its own freedom, its own sovereignty. And today, I mean, it's hard to imagine the Haitian predicament to be worse even than it was, say, a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but at least according to what I've been reading, there is no elected government in Haiti anymore. All the elected officials have left, and it is, I don't know what to call it. It is, it may not really be technically a country anymore, even though it is supposed to be an elected democracy. So it's difficult in the Caribbean and in other parts of the world to attain this kind of sovereignty. Now, as you read through, after you get through the introduction and you're reading through these Union stories, and we get all the way up to page 39, where you all got to, if you look at page 39, it kind of restates what she's been trying to say, but in a little bit, I think, more accessible language in terms of what the workers and the people are trying to do. So she's been talking about how they use the action of strike, how the labor movement developed in using Creole, how it was linked to the Catholic Church, which is itself interesting. They are ready to bid farewell to the failed projects and unfulfilled promises of the previous era. So they know that a lot of the ideas from before, that you had to have your own independent country, they're ready to say goodbye to that, but have yet to bury the conceptual frameworks, political expectations, and historical legacies of their forebears. So like we were talking about, although they are trying to do something new, they're still stuck kind of in the old terminology and the old ways of thinking and acting in the world. Theirs is a moment of categorical uncertainty. So they're still seeking for the terms to deal with this new situation, but it is also an era rife with emergent possibilities. I'm trying to say that they're trying to create, again, these new emergent possibilities out of these former legacies, trying to get beyond them. All right, so